Let's go. Welcome to common dev mistakes that lead to poor localization by agencies. So I'm Sven Lohse. I'm working as a game dev since 2006. I'm the technical director at ROCKFISH Games, which includes managing the game localizations. But I don't just develop games, I also like to play video games. My native language is German, and I prefer playing games in my native language, actually. However, I play most games in English nonetheless, because most of the time I feel like that the translation doesn't quite match the quality of the original. And then I think it doesn't have to be like this. For this reason, I also take part in crowd translations, or do translation mods, or do talks about improving localization. Some words about ROCKFISH Games. We are based in Hamburg, Germany. We are an independent studio founded in 2014, with currently about 40 team members, and we made the EVERSPACE series. I will use a lot of examples from EVERSPACE 2, so a few words about that. EVERSPACE 2 is a fast-paced single-player spaceship looter shooter with exploration in space and on planets. The game was made for PC and consoles with the Unreal Engine. We have a bit more than 200,000 words per language. For comparison, Fellowship of the Ring, the first Lord of the Rings volume, has about 188,000 words, so we are a bit above that. All texts were written in English and then translated into 12 languages. That makes 13 text languages. And English and German are also voice-acted. I will talk about what you as a developer, programmer, UI designer, story writer, project manager can do to improve the quality of the localization that an external localization agency or your internal local department will do for you. Most of this will also apply if you organize a community translation. Now, there's more to localization than just translation. This talk, however, will focus on topics that directly or indirectly affect translation. So I will briefly touch on units and formatting, and we'll talk about what implications localization has on the user interface design, on programming with focus on dynamic text, about working together with a translation agency, and finally I will share some thoughts about localization quality. For the most part, this talk will be a cycle of making you aware of potential problems and offering a solution. Many examples will be in German, but most of them represent a whole bunch of languages, and no German skills are required. So let's wrap up units and formatting real quick. Be aware that especially American players are used to different units and scales, so they might not have any idea if 20 degrees Celsius is boiling hot or freezing cold. Also, dates are important, and if dates are important in your game, be aware that some players might be confused by these formats because they are used to a different order than the one used in your culture. So either localize them or use a format like this, which is at least unambiguous. Different languages have a lot of further rules for which characters and spacings you should use in certain situations. And in my experience, translation agencies pay close attention to these rules and keep pointing them out to the devs. However, at least in my perception, players don't really care. Some probably more than others, so put some basic effort into this. Use format strings instead of hard-coding stuff, but don't get lost in it. Other things have a bigger impact on your localization quality, like UI design. Here's a screenshot of Snowboard Hero, a project from my very early career, first released in 2008 for Java and Brew mobile phones. And the UI designer came up with this UI design. Anyone spotting a potential problem for localization here? The first button on the right happened to have the longest text, and the bottom words are rather short. So he came up with this triangular design. However, this kind of UI design will likely get you in trouble when trying to localize it, because you cannot rely on the text length being the same after translation. So in the translation, this might be the longest word in that column. Here's another example from another game. 2 buttons, previous, next, with previous being a much longer word than next. And here's how it looks in German. In fact, the combined amount of letters is still the exact same, but the distribution is different now. So the guys squeezed the letters a bit to make the right button work and did the same on the left for consistency. So it kind of works, but it's not an ideal result. And the devs needed to manually adjust every screen in their game for each language for everything to fit in. So what can we learn from this? Do not tailor your UI to the exact length of the text in the source language. And the second thing to learn from it is localization is not a final step within production, but should be considered from the very beginning by all departments, starting with, but not limited to, the UI designers. It's not just the job of the translators. I think a common misconception is that the dev team makes the actual game, and then the translation agency will do all the localization work afterwards, or maybe the translation community. But that won't result in a good translation. You as a developer have to do your part to enable them to do a great localization. So one major issue in UI design regarding translation is translated texts can be longer than their source. So how do we deal with that? We could leave some extra space up front. We could design a UI that will dynamically adjust when necessary, like buttons growing and shrinking in size or using scroll bars. Or we could write an email to our translation agency saying, please translate all texts so that they are about the same length as or shorter than the original. And we're done. All the hundreds of buttons, labels, headlines, description text boxes, no extra UI design, no effort in implementing dynamically adjusting elements, problem solved with one short email. So, which tool should we choose? Obviously, that last option is very tempting. However, what will happen if we choose that path? The agency will answer you, at least in my experience, okay, no problem. And then they will start translating the first entry. They will look at the most obvious or closest translation, or you could say the best translation, but unfortunately it's too long. So they will look at the second best. Might still be too long, so they will use the third best option. Next entry, best translation, too long. Second best, there might not even be an alternative translation, so they invent a weird abbreviation for that word, and so on. This won't affect every entry. Some will fit, some will be even shorter, but it can easily affect a lot, like 1 in 4. So you do get a translation. It might be understandable or accessible, so it's not wrong, but it won't be a good translation. It will be a bundle of compromises and trade-offs. It won't feel natural. And this will drag down the immersiveness of your game. Foreign language players will not have the same quality of experience from your game. And many agencies won't warn you about it. They are, in my experience, unfortunately, used to work like that. They will just make the best out of whatever they get from you without complaining. So, which tool do we use then? Well, for the best possible result, all of them at once. So at some point, setting a length restriction is inevitable. But make this your very last line of defense, not your first. Start with the other two options. So let's take a closer look at these. The first question usually is, how much extra text length should I account for in the UI design? How long should my text be allowed to get? 10% longer, 30%? What would be a ballpark number? Now, this depends on a lot of things. First of all, on the source and target language. So let's assume your source is English and your translation includes French and German, which are longer on average. Another thing to consider when boiling this down to a single percentage number is if you have a 2-character button like go, then additional 100% will still only be 2 characters more. They need to find a 4-letter translation then, which is still not much. The OK button is the exception to this rule, which works in most languages. But other than that, make some space or maybe use an icon. On the other hand, if you have a full page of text, then the translator can likely find some less important bits that can be shortened without losing quality. Context, flavor text is more flexible than the description of a skill mechanic, for example. But still, what would be some ballpark figure? Some books come up with pretty hard numbers like 20% or 50%, but truth is, there is no safe threshold. So my recommendation is this one slider label in your graphic options menu. Give it at least these 20%. A button widget that you use all over your game. Invest a good amount of time into it. Allow it to have 2 lines or whatever, so that it can be at least 100% longer. And by that I mean 100% while still looking like it's supposed to look like that, not by using some ugly emergency fallback solution. Because sometimes you do need a very long translation to be precise. And then add this ugly emergency fallback solution on top of that to allow for another like 80%. So for this one case where in this one language where there is no other reasonable option than to have this ridiculously long translation. Ideally, it's not ugly, but at least okay-ish. And texts that are not that important for the immersion can have less, like additional 50% while still looking good, and maybe another 50% where it looks at least okay-ish. Side note, if you spend a lot of time trimming your English text down to the bone to squeeze it into some box by trying different words and shorter expressions and abbreviations, meaning it's already highly compressed in English, you can be sure it won't fit into that box after translation into certain languages. Now, I'm not a UI designer, so I'm not going to give you a UI lesson here. Others can do that better than me. But I still like to show you a few examples of the work of our UI designers, which worked great for our UI localization. So in EVERSPACE 2, we have these card-shaped item descriptions. Here's a simple one called cargo unit. And this one is a little bit more fancy, and even in English, its name needs 2 lines now. But we don't squeeze anything or scale down anything. The whole card just gets higher, and everything else shifts down. In German, we need even 3 lines for this title. And also note how this list item, so this one also got another line because it's longer, and this one now has 2 lines. But at this point, we can't make the card higher anymore because the screen ends at some point. So we have a scroll bar now. And you do need to scroll to see this flavor text, but all the important bits are still visible at first glance. So everything still looks like it is intended to look like that. Here we have a text that reads mainframe expansions. In Spanish, this goes to expansiones del ordenador central. But the text is not in a fixed grid. It is allowed to grow beyond the left, so beyond this middle line, so it can use the available space. It can dynamically occupy additional space. So utilizing dynamic, I forgot to click here. So utilizing dynamic assignment of dimensions horizontally and vertically helps you find space for your text. Consider adding multi-line support, add scrolling, oh, that's too much. Dynamically scaling down text can be a valid tool too, if applied carefully dosed. We have this attribute firepower here, and we did leave some space, but potencia de fuego is still too long, so we scaled it down a little bit, and it still looks okay. So it's automatically shrunken down a little bit. Of course, if the text gets even longer, it becomes increasingly ugly and at some point inconsistent with the other text. But carefully dosed, you might get maybe 8% of space without anyone even noticing. And you can dynamically reduce character spacing, also apply in small doses. So some more examples of buttons without fixed horizontal grid of our game. So we have this upper menu bar here and a similar one at the bottom with space at the side. And maybe also look at the space here. I hope you can see that, yeah. And this is how the German version looks like. So you can see the bar expands here, but the space here and here is now gone. But as long as not all the items grows very large, individual items like Ansicht erweitern here can be significantly wider without destroying the whole bar. So only if all entries were very long, the bar would grow beyond the edges. But in reality, it's only ever individual entries that have to be much longer. And again, allowing longer labels means the translator can choose the most accurate or natural translation over the short trade-off. Here we have a subtitle box with 3 lines, which is usually enough, but sometimes a text gets longer after all. But we are not in a menu here. The player is steering the ship, so they can't manually scroll through the subtitles with their mouse wheel, for example, because they are steering the ship with that. So it looks like this instead.
Tag Roslin, ich benötige Ihre Talente in einer dringenden Angelegenheit. Die Bezahlung ist mehr als angemessen. Ich habe die Koordinaten einer Andockstation in der Prescott-Sternenbasis angehängt. Sollten Sie interessiert sein.
So what we do is automatically scroll the text. The important thing is that in this specific context, the player usually reads roughly along the audio, which is why this works here. However, auto-scrolling is not the answer to everything. This is a mock-up based on real-world examples with auto-scrolling tabs, making the UI very restless and lots of unused space next to it. Then we have auto-scrolling item selections, for example, where you can't see the full item name until you hover over them. An auto-scrolling details panel, where you can see the last line only for a very short moment before it starts scrolling back up for the people who like reading backwards. It's still better than not having a solution at all, but auto-scrolling in the wrong places can hurt the overall UI experience. Okay, diacritics. Here we have a selection of letters from the English alphabet, so with a so-called ascender and baseline. And here we have a selection from the German alphabet. Suddenly, some letters exist which exceed this ascender line. If you don't leave space for these diacritic marks, oh, that's very dark here, but maybe you can see that this, the diacritics go beyond the button, go beyond the space which was reserved for the button. Now let's have a look at a selection of French letters. We had lowercase letters reaching below the baseline before, like this here and here. But now we also have capital letters reaching down below the baseline. which can be a problem for UI elements tailored around all caps text written in English. So this can happen. I hope you can see that what the problem is. So diacritic marks need their space above the text, below the text, and in between lines. When you decide on a font that you want to use in your game, don't just check whether you like the font. Make sure there is a font file available which contains at least most of the characters you need. These are the characters next to the English alphabet you will need for French, Italian, German, and Spanish. Some are more necessary than others. But the more languages you want to support, the more characters you need on top of that. Cyrillic has its very own set of letters, which is still similar to Latin, so good Latin fonts do include Cyrillic. And if a single character for one language is missing, with font editor tool and some copy and paste magic, you can fill in some gaps if it's just about one letter, but you don't have the correct diacritic mark for that specific letter. You can duplicate the letter from somewhere else and then duplicate the diacritic mark from another letter and put it over that, so that works. But don't try to create the complete Cyrillic alphabet unless you really know what you're doing. In any case, most fonts do not contain entirely different writing systems, so you will likely need entirely different fonts for different writing systems, which will have a different style. Dynamic text. So texts that are modified or stitched together at runtime. Every string library in every game engine has a to-upper function, mapping lowercase letters to uppercase letters. However, if you support Turkish, the to-upper functions need to map some characters differently. The lowercase I with a dot now needs to become the uppercase I with a dot. So make sure your game code correctly sets the locale in your game's environment. If you support German, then there's the German sharp S, which historically doesn't have an uppercase variant. So it needs to be mapped to 2 regular S characters instead. However, some of these to-upper functions, like some standard C++ functions, can only map 1 lowercase character to 1 uppercase character. So these map to the lowercase character instead, which is wrong. By now, an official capital sharp S exists, which became an option in 24, and in 24 even became the officially preferred option in standard German orthography. So that's not that long ago. But both options are still considered correct, which is good because the to-upper functions usually don't use this capital sharp S yet, which might be a good idea because many font files do not yet contain this relatively new character. But it also means that this problem still exists in low-level to-upper functions. So, long story short, test what happens to sharp S in your game, especially when you use to-upper. In some fonts, even a lowercase sharp S might look fine within uppercase letters, but in other fonts it doesn't, and of course you don't want to see this. The to-lower function does the opposite. However, my recommendation is do not use it. Why? Because there's actually no valid application for it. So what would be an invalid application? Here's a classic. While creating a dynamic line of text, where one word changes depending on what the user selects here in this box, the dev notices, oh, I already have the string in my string table, so I don't need to create a new one for this one. I just use the one I already have. But now they realize, oh, but it starts with a capital letter up there, and we need it starting with a lowercase letter at the bottom. So they apply the to-lower function at runtime, and everything looks correct in English. However, in German, nouns always need to start with a capital letter, even within a sentence. So the dev applied an English spelling rule to all languages, which the translator can't fix. If it needs to be written in differently in a different context, create a new entry in your string table. Don't use to lower. Variable substitution. Let me drink something. To translate a format string, you need to understand the text, including what's inserted into the gaps. Also keep in mind that other languages have different sentence structure. The order of the parameters can therefore change. Don't make translating your game a puzzle game, even if it is a puzzle game. All modern game engines support self-describing arguments in format strings, which make it much easier to understand what content is being inserted and less confusing if the order needs to change. Also, don't use string concatenation to stitch fragments and variables together, because the translator is then bound to the English sentence structure, and understanding this is even more complicated. Use format strings with named arguments. Gendered terms for people. Let's assume you have a text like this, which might be okay for a little message box, but if a character in your game is saying this line in a little text bubble, Sven is now king/queen of this kingdom, long live the king/queen, that's not very immersive. So what you can do is branch. So you could create two separate strings to have a clean text. Or in the Unreal Engine, there is this concept of format argument modifiers that we used a lot, where you can pass a parameter into the text just like a variable, and then the engine selects from several given options based on that parameter's values. So here you have that variable, and then the engine selects between king and queen and shows this to the user. The translation would be pretty straightforward. Another example, player is now mayor of this town. Mayor is gender neutral, so we don't need branching, right? Here's the German translation. Bam, the ugly slash is back. Why? Because mayor is only gender neutral in English, but many other languages have gendered terms, not only for titles of nobility, but for all kinds of titles, professions, ranks, and even general terms for people like villager, citizen, spectator. How can we solve this? Use one of the solutions above, even if they are not required in English. Player is now mayor or mayor, but Bürgermeister or Bürgermeisterin. That was natural gender, but in many languages, all nouns have a certain grammatical gender. For example, the spoon, der Lepel, der Löffel, but the knife, das Messer. So, along with the grammatical gender, other words like the articles change too. In German we have der, die, das. This is called inflection. The good thing is, you don't have to care about that, because within one language, all spoons have the same gender, so you don't have to distinct between cases, and the translators know the gender and can do all the work. Unless you start to dynamically switch single words within a sentence, or you dynamically stitch sentence fragments together, then inflection becomes a serious problem. An example, in EVERSPACE we have lots of different items to loot or craft, like a pulse laser, a thermogun, a scattergun, or an array of missiles called the jury. And all these items can also be found with a random additional property that is reflected in their name. So, for example, you can also find an efficient pulse laser, or an efficient thermogun, or an efficient scattergun, or a powerful jury. We have all kinds of these affixes in the game, so you could also find a calibrated pulse laser or a rapid pulse laser. These affixes are dynamically assigned to the base item, which is no problem in English. We can just put it in front of the base name and we're done. But what about other languages? So in German we have effizienter Pulslaser, effiziente Thermokanone, effizientes Schrapnellgeschütz. So the ending is different based on the grammatical gender of the base item. Starke Geschworene have this ending again, but not because it's feminine again, but because it's a plural. And so the grammatical number also changes the inflection. And note that the German word is a plural, although the English word is a singular. So it's one jury in English, but a group of people that swore an oath in German. Now, how can we correctly inflect the affixes in every language? One way would be to create an entry for every possible combination of affix and base item. And in fact, in most cases where you have like 3 combinations, this usually is the best solution to handle inflection. However, we have 16 affixes and almost 200 equipable items. That's a lot of combinations. So we need a different solution. Now, we just saw how you can branch on different gender cases. But this time, we would need to discriminate 6 cases. So we stick to the Unreal Engine solution, where you have all the cases in one string. So we created a custom format argument modifier with 6 cases, 1 for each gender and grammatical number combination. Now in English, this would look like this. Efficient, 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 they're all the same, and so on. But the German translator can now translate this whole string with effizienter, effizienti, effizientes, and so on. French has only 2 grammatical genders, but the masculine inflection is sometimes different for nouns starting with a vowel, so we treated this just like a 3rd gender. But in most languages, you don't need 6 different forms. That's why we made the last 2 optional. So this is how it actually looks like for German and English. Okay, now I have all the inflection forms for the affixes. Looks a bit like source code now, but this is the string that we could send into translation. But we still don't know which of them to use for a specific base name. Which inflection index do we need to pass here? Which noun is masculine, which is feminine, which is plural, for example. They differ from language to language, and we don't speak most of them. So we also need to gather some additional information about the nouns. So what we did was something very similar to the affixes. We asked the translators to give us this metadata, again via custom format argument modifier. So this is what the translators got for the nouns. They needed to translate the actual item name, so Pulslaser, Thermokanone, Schrapnellgeschütz, and also added a letter for the gender, so M for masculine, F feminine, neuter, and a second parameter for the plurality, for the grammatical number, so singular or plural. So in the game, we can now request the actual translation by passing meta index 0 or the metadata, so we can decide which form of the affix we need to use. And all the data is in the same string. Now we can put everything together, and our efficient pulse laser can become effizienter Pulslaser. But there are more problems to solve. As you can see in Spanish and some other languages, the item's base name needs to be before the affix. Laser de pulsos eficiente. How can we solve that? Remember when I said do not use string concatenations? Instead of just concatenating both parts, we made the position of the base name part of the affix's format string. So here we have efficient item name or efficient pulse laser, effizienter pulse laser, but laser de pulsos eficiente. Also have a look at this little space here. Germans connect compound nouns, for example, by connecting them with a hyphen. And in Chinese, they basically don't believe in spaces at all. But this is not a problem if we use format strings, because the translator can simply replace this space with, for example, a hyphen, or just remove it completely. So, be careful with dynamic text. Text around dynamic elements or the elements themselves may need to be adjusted to different grammatical genders, numbers, cases, different rules for prepositions, phonetic rules, and so on. Don't use dynamic text if there's no need to. You're likely to create more problem than you solve. With that being said, don't be scared if you don't have a perfect solution. Players are unfortunately used to these problems, but make it a conscious decision if it's not in your budget. Don't get there because you haven't thought about it or you didn't know, because now you know. Context. Let's reflect on how translation works. There are words which have exactly one meaning and have exactly one counterpart in another language with the exact one meaning. However, most of the frequently used words have a whole bubble of meanings. Get your back means take your back, or getting angry means become angry. I didn't get that means I didn't understand that. The specific meaning depends on the context. Other languages have these bubbles too. However, these bubbles are not identical. No German word has exactly all the meanings that get can have. You need the specific context to choose a suitable bubble. There might be more than one valid possibility, but they are never all valid for a respective context. And finally, there are words that don't have a precise translation in that language at all, especially when we're not talking about single words, but about idioms, figures of speech, and wordplays. To really nail the translation for an object, for example, you usually need a very precise idea of what the object exactly is. If a German translator needs to translate "open the gate," they need to know, is it like a big door, or a water gate, or an airlock? Is it a bar gate? And so on. If they don't know this exactly, what they will do in most cases is make an educated guess or just lose the least specific translation, which will kind of work in most cases, but will deteriorate the immersion and will sometimes be just plain wrong. English grammar is rather simple. Therefore, short sentences and single words can become ambiguous. An entry building can be a noun, a building, or a verb, I am building. It can represent several conjugations. So it is ambiguous. Dock at Prescott Starbase can be the dock at Prescott, can be to dock at Prescott, like short for if I press this button, my ship will dock at Prescott. Or can be an imperative, like a task or a command, do dock at Prescott Starbase. The differences can be subtle in English, but important in other languages. So, context is utterly important for an accurate translation. To get the context right for each text, you would actually need translators who know your game by heart, who played it through from start to end, including all side quests and alternative paths, using every weapon and item and skill and character or ship class or whatever you have. And if you're lucky, you might find some skilled crowd translators who in fact do that. But if you have to hire irregular localization agencies, in my experience, they will barely play your game. And then you need to provide context. So the final document you send might look something like this, with the actual text to translate, the English text, and two important columns for context, the actual context column and the IDs. Using descriptive IDs is a great and easy way to provide basic context. Just by looking at the IDs, I can see if something is an interact label, for example. So an infinite phrase. If I press this button, it will scan. Or a task, so which needs the imperative form. Do track the distance call. So context is key for an accurate translation. And as we just learned, the keys, the idea of your localization entries, are a powerful and easy to access tool to provide context. They can also help to establish the context between different elements by putting related entries next to each other in your string table, manually or by using IDs with hierarchical path structure and then sorting them alphabetically. And don't use numbers as IDs or even the hex code that Unreal Engine creates. Consider this a placeholder that you have to replace. Here's an example that totally went off the rails in the initial translation.
Great. Stuck between a rock and a damn flaming meteor. It's a colonial fleet.
Translators are usually native speakers in their target language, but they are often not native in their source language or source culture they are translating from. So there is no flaming meteor in this scene. It's an idiom, or to be precise, a modified idiom or a reference to an idiom. So idioms, figures of speech, cultural references, all these bring two challenges. One is translating them. The other is noticing them in the first place, especially if you are not native to the culture. Otherwise, they might get translated literally, which you really don't want. So you have to make the translators aware of these. You might need to explain the idiom and explain the actual situation, because the translators will likely need to find an alternative. If you're lucky, a similar idiom exists in their language, but if not, they need to fill the gap with something reasonable, for which you can either rely on the story writing skills of your translators, but it's probably better to offer an alternative yourself that has no idiom. References, like pop culture references. These are some of our achievements. Be aware these might be references to Western or just your country's pop culture. Some of them might not be equally known in, for example, Asian cultures. References to high culture, the same. To other games, any cultural reference might not work in another culture. Or does work, but still the translator needs to get the reference. They might not just not have seen that one particular silly movie from the 80s. And then they might translate it literally, which might not make any sense in your game. The solution is, again, make aware of them, explain them, offer alternatives without references. Next kind of reference is a reference to some other part of your game. Agencies have good tools to make sure terms are translated consistently, but sometimes you need one specific previous line in mind to understand another. So here we have, there appears to be a large accumulation of karyons, a kind of hypergluon. And then much later in the game, karyons, Carla mentioned those before, they are superglue, right? So you need this line in mind to understand the meaning of this line. And if you don't, and we would translate this literally, this will make no sense, because gluon and glue won't sound similar in other languages. Be aware, especially for big workloads or tight schedules, agencies will slice the workload into chunks and give them to different translators. So the person translating the lower line might not ever have seen the upper line. The solution is, again, make aware, explain, and for play on words also offer alternatives. So in our dialog document, we have dedicated columns for context and for localization notes. And we ask our narrative designers to fill these in alongside writing the actual dialogue. So all the reference explanations would go here. Form of address. There are several forms of address in English, which can be boiled down to the question, which part of the full name is used to address people? For informal form of address, the first name is used. You are known to us, Adam. This would be the plural form, but it would be inappropriate to address a group of employees in a bank with, hey boys. There you would probably use the formal form of address, which means addressing people by their last name. Or the other way around, if you are using the last name, you are usually on a formal level. Rare in real life, but not that rare in video game settings, the majestic plural. A single person of very high status is addressed as a plural or speaks of him or herself in the plural. And some more. The problem is you. Not you, but the word here. You. This word needs to be translated differently in other languages depending on the form of address. So du, ihr, sie, ihr with a capital I. So which of these cases do we need to use when translating this? This is a complete dialogue with this character. Here we don't have any of these indicators. We don't even know if you is a single person or a group. So what can we do? Again, you, and this time I mean you, need to provide context. The form of address usually depends on things like relationship between two parties and also their status, age, in some languages their gender, and how polite characters are. Which forms of address even exist and when to apply which differs between languages and cultures. So the decision should be made by the translator. But if they make a badly informed decision, it can be very immersion breaking. For example, when buddies are addressing each other formally. Or a clerical authority is addressed informally. So what we did was create a diagram of the relations between characters and their general attitude. Here we have the player, and we group them with his crew, which is he's on an informal level with, and we have neutral characters, on which is more formal level. Also, we have neutral characters who don't care to be polite, like the black marketeer, which will probably still answer informally. We have high status officials, which tend to be more formal even towards enemies, and hostiles who do the opposite. But the way characters address each other in certain situations is only one character trait of many. An eloquent AI uses different words or phrases than an ex-military turned outlaw or an honorable medieval knight. Now, the translator could collect all occurrences of a specific character, read their lines, and try to get a feel for that character, and only then start translating. But most won't invest that time. And even if, you'll still get a better result if you tell them what the idea behind a character is. So we provided this character compendium where you can search for ID and names, and you have a very short character description. Luckily, I didn't have to write this because our narrative designers had already made this and as a byproduct of their design process. So just by browsing through your pipeline and talking to each other can sometimes give you useful context material for your translators. But for some topics, you won't find anything already existing, so you should take the time to create reference material for these. So here I show and explain why are our enemies named Swarmer or Trinage. But I don't know the dialogues as well as the narrative designers or the interface as well as the UI designers and the gameplay programmers. So providing the best possible context is a team task. However, even with experience and linguistic awareness, it's difficult to predict all the ways how a text might be misunderstood, in what respect it might be ambiguous. So we initially only sent the text along with the accompanying material for translation into German. Then we reviewed the German translation, which we are able to because that's our native language. And wherever there seemed to be a misunderstanding or an inaccurate translation, we revised it. But also, we added additional and more precise context comments. And only then we dispatched the dialogues for translation into the remaining languages. For the interface, we went one step further by translating most of the interface into German ourselves. On the one hand, because nobody could translate our own game more accurately than we could. And on the other hand, because while translating, we notice where things might be unclear and can then add additional context information. And only then we dispatch the English text into translation into the remaining languages. And finally, establish an active communication with your translators during translation. We used a Google Sheet through which the translators could ask questions if something was unclear and try to answer these questions as promptly as possible, at least once a day, so they don't start guessing things. Okay, finally, some thoughts about the metrics of localization quality based on my personal perception and experiences. In my perception, the almost only question many people ask when evaluating a translation is it correct? And then they try to refine the translation exactly until it's correct. However, if you want a high-quality translation, it's not enough to ask, is it correct? Because the quality of a translation has a lot of different dimensions, like spelling, punctuation, and formatting. These are, in fact, quite binary. They are either correct or incorrect. We talked about the length of text in UI elements, which can fit or not, but can also seem a bit squeezed in. So we start to have some middle ground here. Then we have grammar and choice of words, where a translation might be technically correct according to the rules of the language. No, I lost my line. Yeah. But a native speaker would usually use a different sentence structure, for example. Meaning of a text in the specific context. A line of dialogue can try to discriminate complicated character relations. We might try to capture emotions, inner conflicts, motivations, and even slight nuances of time tense can mean something slightly different. I struggled, I have been struggling, and so on. So my point here is, in some dimension, there's a lot of room between correct and really good. And there are still many more, like character description. An eloquent AI uses different wording than the washed-up veteran. Was the setting taken into account? In a medieval setting, different wording is appropriate than in a sci-fi setting. A lot of that can very easily get lost in translation, or in fact needs to be recreated in the target language. In the original text, if the original text is funny, the translation should be funny too, which can work more or less well, or just end up being embarrassing. My key point is there are many different dimensions in which a translation can be either poor, just about correct, or can significantly contribute to the immersion, truly draw you into the world it's trying to convey. If you're only aiming for correct, then you're not aiming very high. You are aiming for the bare minimum. Now, the focus of this talk was what devs can do to support better translation, but beyond that, the quality is no longer in your hands. All that is no guarantee that the agency will put in much effort to get these right. And in fact, many of them don't. The dev could order a language QA to improve the initial translation. However, in my experience, most language QA is only designed to get you out of the red area, and even that only in these first 4 categories. The other areas are usually completely ignored after the initial translation, or almost ignored. And my personal impression is that this is an industry-wide problem, because it's not economical for agencies to do better. They are usually paid per word. The longer they work on a line, the less they earn per hour. While the devs usually aren't even able to tell the difference between correct and really good, because they don't speak the language. You might say, okay, the players will tell the devs if the translation is only mediocre. But I think they rarely do that, except if you're still in the red zones up here. I think once the translation moves out of these red zones, players will rarely blame the remaining shortcomings on the translation, but on the game itself. Most players won't say the translation wasn't funny, but will say the game wasn't funny, or the characters were boring, or the setting wasn't interesting. Only very few will do an A/B comparison with the original beyond the tutorial level. So as long as the devs can't appreciate a better translation, it doesn't benefit the agencies to provide one. So they will work on making translations faster and cheaper, not better. So evaluating translation quality is not easy. It's likely not enough to have your French grandmother take a quick look at it. So you need someone who has a sense for which things make a dialogue immersive, which terms make a setting interesting. Someone with the qualities of an author. We reviewed our German translations ourselves, and for some languages we had some great crowd translators who evaluated and refined our translation, but unfortunately I can't offer a solution to this problem. Therefore, here's my call to you. Find ways to evaluate the translation quality you are paying for, not just for correctness, but also for everything that truly makes it good.